Alrighty, this video is going to be a little weird because of the way that we are going to be using React to construct components that don't necessarily come from a static reference from an import. It's not something you see so often, but it's perfectly valid. However, the first step I want to do is I want to notice how I had to make sure that, that the state existed before I accessed Dialogs. You'll notice that if I don't click on login, that the state of the app container is empty. What I want to have happen is I want the second that we get subscribed, I want to receive the results of this subscription, of the dialog, so that we can set it to an empty array initially and not have to worry about if it exists yet. We do this by fixing two things. The first thing is, instead of doing component did mount, we'll do component will mount. And that means that this code will execute before the first render. So that'll make sure that we have a state before the first render. But we'll still run into the same problem. If we refresh, you'll notice that we still have the problem of the app container not having a state. And that's because the Dialogs observable does not publish an initial value. So we can fix that by going back into our app store and coming down here and simply saying after the scan, that's important, after the scan, say start with empty array. By doing that, whenever and combined with the publish replay, the second we subscribe to this observable, we will get an empty array. Because that happens, the state will be set to an empty array, the dialogs will be an empty array, and we will no longer have to make sure that the state exists. So now I should be able to remove that check entirely, come back over here and reload, and we should see right there, empty array. But if I click login, now we have an array with one object. So now we have to do fewer checks. So two changes, we say component will mount instead of did mount, and then most importantly, we have the observable sequence start off with the default value. So now what I want to do is I want to actually go out and render these dialogs. So that's actually going to be pretty easy, but it's going to be kind of weird looking. So I'll walk you guys through it. I'm going to say const dialogs equals this dot state. Notice that I'm using deconstruction syntax here. Then we say const dialog stack equals dialogs.map. Dialog goes into a function. Now we're going to do something very important as far as pay close attention to my capitalization. I'm going to say const dialog component equals dialog types dialog.id. Now, what I'm doing, remember, the dialog types comes from loading in that stuff from WebPack, all the files in that folder, which come from the default export of our login dialog, which is over here, which has this ID, which has a reference to this component that is just a normal class. But in order to render this component in JSX, I have to stuff it into a variable that starts with an uppercase character so that it gets created as a component and not an HTML element. So now what I can do in this map is I can simply return dialog component passing in dialog.props, and also, most importantly, key equals dialog.id. Because we're going to be rendering this out as an array, all of these components returned must have an ID. Now again, remember that, I know I brought this up earlier, a good while ago, but just because we have a JSX syntax of accessing a class, in this case a class that's hidden behind a variable name, doesn't mean that the login dialog is going to be instantiated every single time that this render method gets invoked. React will only instantiate it once until it goes away, and then it'll instantiate it again if it shows up again. All right, so as far as our dialog stack, what are we going to do with it? The first thing is, in the class name of our application, I'm going to go ahead and put in a template, and set this template string, dialog stack.length, dialogs open, dialogs closed. So now the application will have a class on it indicating whether or not there are any dialogues in the dialog stack. Then above class name inner, I'm going to say div class name equals dialogs. And then I'm simply going to print out the dialog stack right there, right in the DOM. All right. So with that, we should be able to come over here, refresh. And in this case, I'm going to go to elements, and I'm going to open up our mount, open up this. We have an empty dialogs div, and then we have our inner. Our dialogs are now closed. But if I hit login, check this out, dialogs open. Unfortunately, we didn't get a... we got an error, which I'm sure I did something stupid somewhere. Dialog component is this. I guess our dialog types aren't getting properly loaded. Let's go ahead and console log them out and see what it looks like. Actually, what am I doing? I'm going... Well, no, I can't because it... Oh, yes, I can. Yes, I can. Put a breakpoint right there. Switch to Chrome, attach, hit F5. Attach to Chrome, let's refresh. Okay, it's not going to hit the breakpoint the first time, but that's fine. Now I'm going to hit login, and we get an error. If we scroll down, it seems like we're having some issue here with our debugger. So in that case, I'll just do the old console log dialog types. I hate doing that, it's so obnoxious. All right, so let's see what that is. It's object, and the object is empty. So unfortunately, our dialog types are not being properly loaded. So if we come back in here to index, oh, wow. Ugh. I swear I can regex good. Problem is I used a caret, which denotes the beginning of a match, instead of a $, which denotes the end of a match. I'm sure you guys caught that if you're familiar with regular expressions, but go ahead and fix that. Just a small little, really embarrassing error. But, you know, stuff like that happens. And now we're getting a crazy error. It looks like a compiler error. It says, cannot resolve file or directory lib container. So now it is working, but our login dialog, unfortunately, it's... It can't resolve lib container. Yes, you can. Oh, because it's component. You guys probably caught that too. It's getting late. Anyway, so that was just a fun little excursion. The only changes I made was in index. In the dialogues, I fixed that regular expression, and then I fixed a typo in my login dialog. So now, if we refresh, in our console window, we should get a nice object that has a dialog login with the function login dialog. So now I can go ahead and I can remove that console log out. I need to figure out why the debugger decided to not work on me. Anyway, now for the big demonstration. Should be able to come over here, and I should be able to hit login and check that out. Now the Dialogs open class is on the C application. And inside of the dialogs element, we have our login dialog. So I think that's pretty cool. All right, let's go ahead and style this. So this is actually a login dialog, or a dialog rather, a modal dialog. So I'm going to go and style this in app.scss. And inside of app.scss, I'm going to go ahead and come down here. I'm going to style our dialog. So I'm going to say greater than dialogs. Again, I'm right underneath the C application selector. And I'm going to say, instead of dialogs, I'm going to start off with the display none, because we don't want them to appear unless there's anything else. Position absolute. I'm actually going to remove the display none for now so I can watch it change as I add these rules. So position absolute, left 0, top 0, width 100%, height 100%, z index, we'll do 600. I know I'm using arbitrary z indexes here. It's generally a bad idea. I should really put all my z indexes into variable, but whatever. Flex direction column and align content center. then greater than section. So this part will actually select the inside of a dialog. Inside of section, I want to go ahead and say include raised, max width 600 pixels, margin auto, padding 10 pixels, and then I want to say greater than h1 to select the h1 out of each dialog with a margin 0 and a font size of 14 pixels. So with that, we now have our dialog appearing here at the top instead of where it should be appearing, which is the center. And that's because Dialogs doesn't have a display of flex. But let's fix that. Inside of Dialogs, I'm going to set the default. I keep on typing what I'm saying. I'm going to have the default display. There we go. Once I set it, I can type it, of none. And so by default, the dialogs will not appear at all. But then I'm going to say and dialogs open. So again, now I'm attaching this rule to the C application selector. I'm going to go ahead and do a couple things. The first thing I will do is say .dialogs display is flex, hit Control S, and now check that out. We have a login dialog right there. But I want to make this a modal dialog. I want to, although it is right now because we can't click through, I want it to gray out the entire application. So inside of the dialogs open rule, I want to say and after for the pseudo element, content, I'll go ahead and make that empty string, background transparatorize, however you say that nasty word. I'm going to transparatorize color background by 0.3. So that's just going to adjust the opacity of this color. And then I'm going to say position, come on, you can do it. Position absolute, top 0, left 0, width 100%, height 100%, z-index will be 500. And now we see that we indeed have a dialog. Now we have no way of closing this dialog yet, but that's fine. That'll be handled by the dialog itself. But yeah, that's really about it. That's our dialog subsystem. So let's go through it one more time. Our dialog system primarily is controlled by an action called dialog set. And dialog set simply allows us to specify an ID, an isOpen flag, and additional properties. We have one dialog called dialog login. Then, inside of our dialogs folder, we have components, in this case login.js, which is a container and does stuff, that exports itself as an object that has an ID and a component. That is then picked up by the index file, which will automatically load any file in this directory. Again, that happens at build time, not compile time. The way context works in WebPack is it will take any file that matches this regular expression and bundle it just immediately. So you don't want to make the regex too broad, because then you'll get a bunch of modules imported that you don't want. But anyway, so those are the dialog types. That's the dialog action. The way it's hooked together is through the dispatching the action, which happens in a lobby sidebar. We simply say this dispatch, which of course goes back into the dispatcher, dialog set, dialog login true. When it's dispatched, it then gets dispatched to the App Store, which then processes the dispatching of dialog set into an array of all of the dialogs that are open. Then, inside of our app.js, we subscribe to that dialog stack with this so that we update the state every time that observable changes. And then we simply combine both the dialog stack as well as the dialog object provided by this file into an array of components that we simply render out into the screen. So it seems a little bit roundabout, but this is the first sort of end-to-end example of an action being dispatched to a store producing an observable value, to a component listening to that value, to it doing something different based off of that value. So it's really the core of our infrastructure. And the more we work with actions, it might feel very unnatural at first, but the more we work with actions, the more it will I don't want to say make sense, but the more comfortable you will be, because the separation of concerns afforded by this architecture allow us to write very clean, maintainable code without having to worry about business logic details. But with that, that is the implementation of our dialog subsystem. All that remains really is to implement the login dialog itself. So I think we'll do that in the next video, and we'll see you guys then.